Okay.
Yeah. So I'm not sure you're in the end of the process of writing a book on agents, and in that book you have described several properties of agency. Is that what you call it? Properties of agency?
Sure.
Right. And I was wondering if you could describe those properties. And
yeah, happy to. So yeah, as you said, I've just finished a book which will come out in October called Free Agents, which is all about agency and the evolution of free will actually in humans. But prior to that, something that's already come out as a paper that I co-wrote with my student Henry Potter, which is called Naturalizing Agent Causation. And the problem that we were looking at there was really a philosophical one, which is how can you say that an agent is the cause of something happening? How can we say that organisms do things, for example? I mean, other things in the universe don't do anything, right? Rocks and electrons and planets and things don't do things. Things happen to them, around them, near them, whatever, in them, but they don't do anything, right? We don't grant them any kind of causal power. And it's a sort of a philosophical conundrum as to what criteria there should be that would justify saying that, yeah, an agent did this thing, was the cause of that thing happening. And there's a lot of sort of challenges to that idea. And really, we focused on three of them. The most simple one is simply that something outside the system, whatever it is, we can call it an organism, say, caused the event to happen, right? So something has happened. We want to know what was the cause. And we could say, say somebody pushes you down the side of a hill. Well, you didn't cause that. They caused that. Or even better, we could say gravity is the thing that's causing you to continue to fall, right? So it can be the case that, and of course this is true for organisms too, they're not always the cause of everything that happens to them, right? Sometimes there's an external cause. So if we're going to move beyond that, we want to say there's an internal cause. And there you kind of come into two problems, which are both of them. The idea is, okay, the organism's not being pushed around by something outside it, but maybe it's being pushed around by something inside it. Maybe it's being pushed around by its own parts. And so it's a kind of a reductionism where you say the whole thing is not the cause. It's just things are happening within it that are pushing it around. And there's really, Henry, my student, sort of landed on this distinction that I find really useful, because when people start to talk about that, I think they make two different arguments that are sort of reductive, but they're reductive in a different way. So one of them we call vertical reductionism, where the idea is to say, look, you could say psychologically that you did things for certain reasons. You believed something, you had a goal, you had an intention, you had a desire, and therefore you did X, right? But a neuroscientist might say, well, actually, all of that beliefs and desires is just neurons firing, right? So there's a physical basis for it. So we can go down a level vertically and say, this is where the real causation is happening in these neural circuits. Now, once you start doing that, it's hard to justify a principled level at which you should stop, because a molecular biologist or biochemist might say, well, actually, look, you're saying it's neural circuits doing things, but really it's just ions flowing in and out of ion channels across the membrane of a cell, and it's all biophysics, down there. While a physicist might look at that and go, look, guys, come on, it's not that at all. It's just atoms, and it's electrons, and it's quarks, and it's subatomic particles, and it's quantum fields, and they're just obeying the Schrodinger equation, and it's all deterministic. And that's where the real causes lie. It's just physics in the end. It only looks to you like there's that causation at these higher levels just because it's complicated, right? We don't really know what's going on. So that's one of the challenges that has to be met, I think, if we're to say, no, that's not right. Really, it's the agent doing things. It's not just its parts. Now, there's another way to do a kind of reductionism, which we call horizontal reductionism. So rather than going down in sort of scales of reality, the idea here is that, okay, yeah, you do have a whole big thing, but actually it's just this one thing within it. It's just this one neural circuit firing that caused the organism to do this. Or in a simple like a bacterium or something. It's just this biochemical state that caused the organism to do whatever it was. And that one's really tricky to get around because, of course, you know, especially in neuroscience these days, lots of neuroscientists make their living finding out which circuits are involved in which functions. And you know, you can go in and you can drive a neural circuit and you can cause an organism to do something. So it really does look like the parts of the organism may be pushing it around. So those were the sort of challenges. And then there's some other sort of more abstract philosophical stuff where you can say, look, it's not the agent causing thing, it's events within the agent. And it's sort of similar to say stuff that's happening where even at the psychological level, you could say it's not you that's causing something, it's your beliefs and your intentions and your desires and your goals that are the cause of things. And they're just happening within you. You're just a place where things happen. Right? Well, Henry and I both don't think that any of those arguments is right. And clearly, when we look at agents, they seem to do things. So trying to naturalize that without having to invoke some kind of mysterious soul or spirit or something was what we were after. And so we thought about the problem and basically came up with a set of criteria that we think characterize agents that we know about, so living organisms, and justify the idea that the whole thing is the cause, right? The whole agent, and it can't be reduced to any little bit of it. It can't be reduced down to just atoms or whatever. So those criteria, there are 8 of them in that paper. And the first is thermodynamic autonomy. So what that really means is that the system, the organism has to be a system, right? It has to have an inside and an outside. It has to be separated from the environment. And that's interesting because what that means is it's actually causally insulated from the environment. So even the simplest single cells, right, they're enclosed within a membrane. And that membrane is an insulator from a lot of chemical and physical causes outside of it. So there's all kinds of stuff happening outside that are not affecting what's going on inside, thanks to that barrier or boundary. And of course, more complicated things like us have an external skin and so on that is a barrier with the environment. Now that's tightly linked to the second criterion, which is persistence through time. And now lots of things persist through time, right? A rock persists through time, but it does it in a very different way to a living organism. So a rock persists through time by doing nothing, right? By being completely inert and static and staying exactly the same. And organisms persist through time in exactly the opposite way to that. They persist as dynamic patterns, right? They persist through flux. It's only through this dynamic change that they're able to keep going. In fact, it is a set of processes, right? That is what characterizes life. And in fact, if you think about what happens when a living thing dies, the stuff is all there. The arrangement might be the same. It's the dynamics that get lost, right? So the dynamics are the life itself, the processes that are happening. And that thermodynamically, to keep those things going takes work, right? The whole system has to work to keep itself going. And it does that by having all of these different processes kind of constraining and creating each other, right? So there's a closed kind of a loop aspect to it, where the whole thing is working. All of the parts are working to generate the whole, and the whole is working to keep all the parts constrained in the pattern that is that organism. So those two very basic things are just properties of organisms, but they're properties that already give us a clue that being an organism is an active, holistic thing, right? It's not just a passive, static sort of thing, right? So, and that brings us to the next criterion, which is the idea of endogenous activity. So the organism is this fluxus, this hive of activity. It's not just sitting there waiting for a stimulus to respond to. It's not a passive thing that's just going to be poked and pushed around by something in the environment. Instead, it's waiting. Now it's interested in the environment. It has to be to stay alive because the environment is usually changing and the organism may have to adapt to that. But it's not really the case, even though, you know, in a lot of experiments, we isolate things, right? We hold everything constant and we try to figure out, how does the organism respond to this thing? How does the bacterium respond to this food signal set, right? But that gives a very kind of a forced perspective on what's really a much more complicated context-dependent process. So the organism is constantly in flux, and it's listening to, or sort of trying to perceive things in the environment, and then it's accommodating to those things. So it's rearranging, it's reconfiguring its internal state, and that may be a sort of a metabolic reconfiguration, or it may be something that allows it to move, right? So one way to keep itself persisting, if environmental conditions are no longer conducive to it, wherever it is to move somewhere else. And so that's a very basic kind of aspect of agency, the ability to respond to the environment and react to it, right? But not in a passive kind of a reflexive way. And that so then that ties into this the fourth one, which is holistic integration. So even for the simplest sort of behavior that we know about, which, you know, I think bacteria moving towards a food source. So this chemotaxis in bacteria, really apparently simple process. There's a few receptors on the surface of the bacterial cell for sugars or other food sources, nutrients. And when those are detected, signals are sent to the flagellum, which is the little rotating things like in the outboard motor of the bacterium, to tell it to spin one way or spin another way. And depending on which way it spins, it'll keep going in a straight line or it'll turn around. And just by sort of changing how much it goes in a straight line versus turning around, it can go up a gradient towards a food source. So it looks like the bacterium as a whole is being pushed around by those elements within it, the receptor, the signal transduction proteins, and a sort of a linear pathway that goes straight to the motor. But that's an illusion. That's not true at all, in fact. There is all kinds of context dependence to even that simplest sort of behavioral response. So the nutrient status of the bacterium will affect the response. What other sort of things are outside in the world will affect the response. How you know, it senses how much crowding there is from other bacteria, for example. Temperature will affect the response, pH, osmolarity, and it's not an instantaneous thing. It's a process that happens through time, and in fact, the response of the bacterium to a signal right now depends on what the signal was a minute ago. That's how it tells whether it's going up a gradient or down a gradient. It effectively compares those two things because the receptors adapt. So the point of that is just to say that there's a context dependence to that, which is really holistic. I mean, it's really the whole bacterium integrating all these different sources of information and deciding where to go. And, you know, I mean, it's a stretch maybe to call that cognition in the sense that we use when we refer to humans.
Right.
But I feel like it's a basic kind of cognition, you know, and I think many people would view it as that. So those sorts of things, I think, get away from, first of all, the external determinism, right? It's not just pushed around by things in the environment. It's paying attention to them, but it's not passive. And then secondly, the horizontal reductionism in this direction, where you'd say it's just this part that's pushing it around. Things are happening within it, and it's not in charge. And I think that's not right. I think it's really a big context-dependent system. So now the next several properties are more to do with getting around vertical reductionism, which is really tricky, right? Because it's hard to escape the idea that, say in complex organisms like us, we have these mental states. Apparently, we think we act on, on account of those mental states for reasons that we can think about and choose. But what if that's an illusion? It's all just neural circuits, or it's all just biochemistry, or really it's all just physics. So I tackle that in the reverse order here. So the fifth criterion is some low-level indeterminacy, and that honestly, it's a property of the universe. A requisite property of the universe, I think, more than of the agent, in the sense that if it were true that low-level physics, really sort of at the quantum level or yeah, even just the classical level actually were completely deterministic, there would be no choices, right? There's only one option. What's going to happen was always what was going to happen from the dawn of time to the end of time, right? So thankfully, well, basically that would leave no room. It would leave no causal slack in the system for reasons to have any effect on anything. What would it matter what things mean, right? What some neural pattern means that you want such and such. What does it matter what it means? The physics is just going to determine what happens, right? So now, thankfully, the physics doesn't seem to be deterministic. Actually, there's lots of indeterminacy, very, very fundamentally at the quantum level, but you can make arguments about indeterminacy even at the classical level.
That's right.
Which come from thinking about, whether numbers are given with infinite precision all at once.
Right.
So there's a whole sort of field there that is very interesting, but I won't go into the details. The point that we come to in the paper is that if you know the low-level details, the positions and momenta of all the atoms in an organism, and you know the laws of physics, and you plug everything into the Schrodinger equation, that's not sufficient to determine the net state of the system, right? It's only a probabilistic determination, and the actual thing that will turn out can be partly random. So what that does is that creates some causal slack in the system. And so that it means that something else, some higher order configuration, could impose some constraints on those probabilities, can shape the outcome. Given certain probabilities just of the atoms doing things, another constraint can come into play and channel things down one way or another. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so from what you're saying is this low-level determinism allows for a top-down causality because there's enough slack. And your argument, if it was fully deterministic, then that top-down would not be possible.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Now, some philosophers argue against that idea, though. In fact, a very popular view is compatibilism, the idea that actually agency is compatible with determinism, but I have never been able to see how that could possibly work. It tends to be an argument that things just get really complicated and unpredictable. That's an argument about what we know and can predict. It's not an argument about the organism itself. So what we want to say, right, we want to get to the point, if we're naturalizing agent causation, that we're saying an agent can be doing things for its reasons, right? And reasons can be causes in the system. Now, if that's true, then what that means is that, say, the neural patterns in your brain, which, there has to be some physical instantiation of reasons, those physical patterns must have some meaning, and it has to be that the meaning is the thing that can drive what happens or influence what happens, not the low-level details. Now, you can say that, well, for any meaning, say it's a macroscopic pattern of a bunch of neurons firing in a certain pattern that kind of represents, say, a goal or represents a threat in the environment or something like that. You could say, well, yeah, okay, but that macroscopic pattern has to be instantiated in some microscopic pattern at any given moment. So really, it's the microscopic pattern that's doing the work. It's all syntax, neural syntax. It's not neural semantics, right? And that argument we think doesn't work because actually that macro state, that pattern, can be instantiated by lots of low-level states. So it's multiply realizable. That's the next property, multiple realizability. And what that means is that you can change a lot of the low-level details in, say, some pattern of neural firing, and the meaning, the macro state, the way it's interpreted by some other set of neurons, won't change. Right? So sometimes when you change the micro states, you'll convert the whole thing into a new macro state, but sometimes you won't. And so if you're thinking about causality, it doesn't seem right to fix the causality at the micro level if you can change the micro level and nothing happens, right? If you want to say the micro level A, the micro state A is the cause of X happening, and you change A to A prime and X still happens, well, that doesn't seem to fit with our normal sort of counterfactual reasoning around causality. So multiple realizability I think is key. And we're learning, more and more in neuroscience that that's the way the nervous system works. It doesn't depend on the low-level details. They're filtered out, they're averaged over, they're integrated, actively integrated over. They're coarse-grained in a way that, first of all, allows the nervous system to tolerate a lot of noise that's going on. But secondly, vests the macro states with the causal powers, the meaning of the states that actually is important in settling the outcome of what's going to happen. And that meaning then relies on this seventh property, which is historicity. So the idea there, when you talk about meaning, sometimes scientists get a bit antsy, right? Yeah, meaning sounds a bit woo. It's not like information, which is very quantifiable and technical. You can localize it. You can see how it's encoded. Meaning is not like that, right? Meaning is a distributed sort of thing that it's even hard to, you can't localize it, right? If you think about like the meaning of the words that I'm saying right now, they're not localized in the sounds coming out of my mouth. It's an interpretive relational thing between a speaker and a listener, right? So the meaning is not in the sounds. It's not even in the squiggles on a page if it's written. It's in the ideas that it evokes in a listener. And you could say the same thing within the brain. The meaning of a pattern is not contained within it. It's in this sort of set of relations that it engenders. And to understand that, you have to think you can't think instantaneously, right? The meaning is just not there in an instant. It's only there through time. Or it only emerges through time. It emerges through experience and it emerges through evolution. So evolution can set, for example, in a bacterium, the meaning of a particular signal is go towards that signal or go away from that signal if it's, say, a toxic chemical or something like that. Right? So you've got a kind of a grounding of what the signals mean. And the signal is completely arbitrary, right? It's just some biochemical thing is phosphorylated or not within the bacterium, or in your brain, some pattern of neurons are firing. There's nothing intrinsic about it that has meaning. It's only that historical connection with a stimulus, which may have so it has a reference, so it refers to something, and it may have a consequence. It's for something, right? So that historicity grounds things. And then the final aspect that we think is really important is what we call agent level normativity. And this gets all the way back to the very first characteristics I spoke about, this struggle to persist as a holistic pattern. So the normativity just means it's a value-based thing, right? So it's good for something, and that can only be true relative to some purpose. So there can be no value just in an absolute terms. It has to be valued for something, and the purpose in this case is persisting. So organisms want to persist. So the meaning that they configure into their circuitry is based on adaptation to things in the environment and the responses that the organism can have to those things. And what that means is that you end up with the system doing things for reasons that are not reasons of any of the parts, right? The parts don't have any reasons. The agent has reasons because evolution is acting at the level of the whole organism. The organism is the locus of fitness in evolutionary terms, and it becomes the locus of concern and the locus of control, the locus of agency. So we think that all of those things together collectively justify the idea that agents are doing things for their own reasons in a non-mystical kind of a way that doesn't violate any laws of physics, right? The basic laws of what the forces acting on atoms and things there's no new physics down there. It's just constraint by organization for a purpose, and the purpose is to continue persisting.
So a couple of weeks ago, I asked GPT-4 to generate the definitions of these 8 properties just by its name, I believe so. And you checked out the definition and you thought it was correct. And so the question is, can you does GPT-4 have agency according to your criteria, or does it not? And can we go through each one and say whether it does or does not have that criteria?
Yeah, super interesting question. So so first let me say these criteria, as I talked about them, are things that we see in living organisms that we think justify agent causation, and in all of the organisms that we know about, they're all there, right? But they can be there to varying extents. And I think it's not an all or none thing. I think, for example, I think we have more agency than bacterium does, right? We have more degrees of freedom. We have more flexible choice. We plan over longer time frames, and we control more things in the world. So
just a question about that. So you have some sort of definition, I guess, of having more agency somewhere.
Yeah, well, I kind of avoid definitions, to be honest. But I have, I guess, the concept that I just sort of outlined. So those kinds of, again, the criteria, how would you judge something as having more or less? And I think that idea of being able to act over longer time frames, be more flexible in more different, novel scenarios, and control more things at once, and think about more things at once, and so on. To me, those seem sort of reasonable, qualitative things. Although, but one of the points I want to make is that I don't think it's a linear scale. I think there can be different kinds of agency where there may be these properties might separate, actually. So if we're thinking about GPT-4 or these other large language models, obviously they're fascinating. They really can give this sort of impression of sentience, which I think is a false impression, but a very convincing one. But as far as agency goes, I don't think they're anywhere near agents, because they don't do anything. Right? I mean, they don't act in the world. They put out a response to a prompt. So I mean, they're kind of doing something sort of internally, right? They grab something and some stuff comes out. So would you say, what's interesting to ask there? Well, first of all, let's go down the list. All right, thermodynamic, autonomy, and persistence. They're not striving to keep themselves organized in the way that a living organism is, right? So they're not. They don't have that precarious nature that life has, where it's this dynamic process, and you have to keep that process going. If it stops, you're dead. So GPT-4 is not like that, right? You can turn it off, and you can turn it on again in the morning, and it'll still be fine. So it doesn't have those criteria where it doesn't have a selfish reason to care about the state of the world or the state of itself, right? Okay, so those kind of criteria just don't apply. It's not really endogenously active. I don't know even how to judge that criterion. I mean, the one thing that I think it does have, maybe, is this holistic integration, but not necessarily in a causal way, just in a way that's different from a normal, hardware computer, in that it seems like the whole system is involved in thinking about what the next thing to say should be, right? If that's not too anthropomorphic. It does feel like, I mean, obviously it's going through levels, but it's hard to go in and say, you know what, it was this artificial neuron here that drove that output. And in fact, as you'll know, it's really hard to even go in and interpret what's happening. It's kind of a big black box, and it's really, really complicated. And I think, like many living systems, it may be near, at least, to non-decomposability, right? You can't decompose what it's doing because the sort of conditionality between the elements is where the business is happening, right? It's sort of a relational thing. So maybe it has that, and if that's right, then I think it has that in spades, right? I mean, it has the complexity of it, the amount of information that it's given, the sort of the amount of data, and the number of training trials that it goes through. Give it what I would think is an alien kind of intelligence for the task that it has to do. right? I think it does things in a remarkable way, in a superhuman way. It's, given all of the different things that it can respond to. But I don't think it does it. I don't think it's approaching artificial general intelligence. And really, it's not programmed to be artificially generally intelligent. And a general intelligence for me is something that can act in the world in a way that is, it's predictive. It's based on understanding, causal understanding of what goes on in the world, and an understanding of what it can do in the world and what will happen if it does X or it does Y, and whether that will be a good thing for it or not. And so all of those things for me, and that kind of intelligence, natural intelligence, is completely tied up with agency. It's about, and it's funny, when it's hard to define intelligence, as you'll probably know. Right. And there's all kinds of definitions that people use in computer science and psychology and cognitive science and behavioral genetics and other sorts of areas, right? It's easy to define stupidity, or it's at least it's easy to recognize it, because you recognize it when stupid people do stupid things, right? You say that was a stupid thing to do. And so my point is that it's cashed out in action, right? You can see in an action that was not a good thing to do for the person, right? And I would say intelligence cashes out in action as well in the opposite way, where you can say that was a good thing to do. That's adaptive, right? That's appropriate behavior based on an understanding of the world, understanding the causal dynamics, so you're not being fooled by things, you're not being surprised by stuff that you should have expected, and you're able to predict over a longer time frame and so on. So GPTs, the large language models just doesn't arise. They're just not causally situated in the world in a way that would enable them or incentivize them to build up that kind of structure of understanding. And so the other sorts of things, well, the low-level indeterminacy, that's just as I said, a property of the universe, whether it manifests within the hardware of the, a large language model. I mean, some of them have like variational autoencoders. They have random stuff that they draw on, right? So that probably is at play, and I think it would need to be at play for a system like that ever to become an agent. I don't think it's sufficient. I just think that's a necessary condition.
Right.
And then the other ones, multiple realizability. It probably is at play actually already.
Yes.
Those different sort of big higher order patterns, right? And then historicity, well, they learn, obviously, right? So I think that's somewhat at play. The agent level normativity, though, I think is not, because they don't care. They don't know that they're alive. They're not trying to stay organized, or they're not trying to do anything. They just do what they're programmed to do. So I think it's definitely not agential as it stands, although it has sorry, I was just going to say it has some interesting sort of sub properties there that are relevant, I think. Yeah.
Right. So it's like 4 out of the 8 that it has a sort of satisfies a agential characteristics, part of the 8. So given that this is really just a speculative question, how would you actually I guess train a AI like this so that it has the remaining 4, which would be, I believe, thermodynamic, autonomy, persistence, endogenous activity, and agent level normativity? Do you have any ideas of how that would happen?
Yeah, I mean, it's a super interesting question, right? I mean, what would it take? Well, first of all, there's the question, what would it take to build an artificial general intelligence? And I actually think you'd have to build an artificial agent.
Probably we could simplify. Maybe we could simplify the question and just say, let's just say that this agent lives only in the space of languages, so it doesn't need to actually interact with the real world. So its universe is just languages.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so what I was going to say was was that I think you may have to embody the the agent.
Mm-hmm.
However, that doesn't necessarily mean a physical body. I think it could be a virtual body, right? But having a body means being organized a certain way, but a certain dynamic way, where the fact that that organization is precarious, as I mentioned earlier, is sort of one of the defining characteristics, and that gives it gives a normativity and a purpose to the thing that can anchor everything else, and that normativity in this case would be to persist. Right? So that's what it is for living organisms. That's their master function, and everything else, all their other goals, are scaffolded on top of that in some way. Now, it's interesting to ask, does the master function have to be persistence? Maybe it can be something else, right? Maybe you can have a different kind of a master function that still is kind of broad enough to give some normativity to everything else that the system can do. I don't know what to think about that. The simplest sort of scenario is that you embody it, right, in a robot, and that it has to do certain things, and that you can tell whether it's being intelligent or not based on whether things are good for it. Right? And so one of the ways that organisms learn what's good for it is that we develop this causal understanding of the world, and we do that through this history of intervening on the world causally. So because we're agential, we can intervene on the world, and then we can see what happens, right? If you're just passively observing things, you'll possibly detect all kinds of meaningful correlations and associations and can extract something about statistical regularities in the world. But you'll also extract lots of non-meaningful statistical associations that are just correlations by happenstance, or they're not causal things. They reflect other causal effects, right? So if you're just passively observing, you're just getting data, it's very hard to test causal hypotheses and really develop a causal understanding. So what we do, and the other thing that, the other reason why we do this is, the other big difference between our brains and these large language models is our brains run on like 20 or 30 watts or whatever it is. And the large language models are obviously hugely power hungry, right? So one of the interesting outcomes of being extremely energy efficient, I mean, really, really mean with the amount of energy that you can use, is that it forces the brain to compress, right? We have to make these compressed representations of things. So we can't store all the details of everything. We can't pay attention to everything that's out in the world. We can't remember every little thing that happens, right? So there's an intense pressure to be extraordinarily efficient. And that comes from, the way that the brain is designed, and also the energy demands of that a living organism has to meet in order to keep that metabolic demand met. So it's interesting to think about the importance of, sort of compression layers and things within these kinds of models, where, and think about how is it that we, especially young children, learn causal things about the world in this incredibly efficient way, where we don't have to have billions and billions of training examples, really, really efficient learning what we need to learn. So how is that? And how do we get this kind of causal understanding through causal intervention in the world? What does that architecture look like? And I don't see any principled reason why we couldn't build that in an artificial system. I don't think there's anything special about the wetware. I think there's something special about the architecture, functionally speaking, but not really the nuts and bolts necessarily. There's no principled reason to think that there is. So so it might be possible to build a system that is embodied in some way, that intervenes on the world, that learns causal structures in the world, and that tries to do something, whether that something is keep itself alive or some other kind of master function. And then if it develop reasons for doing things, if it has that sort of normativity and some ability to encode meaning and some causal understanding of the world, and based on all of that, it's deciding to do X or Y at any given moment, then I think that's agency.
Okay.
I think that would be. You know, how intelligent it would be depends on the way you would build it, I think. And I mean, let me just say one thing, because I don't want to sound overly casual about the idea of building such a thing. I think there's a huge sort of ethical questions to be asked
Right.
about whether we should try to build something like that. Now, personally, I would find it really interesting to try and build that in a virtual sort of setting, which I think could be done in a way which could be a test bed for understanding biology. But maybe even there, people might say, well, you know, if you build a virtual real agent, maybe it's still you'd still have some responsibility towards it. Yeah, right. Interesting idea.
But do you think that general intelligence is requires these 8 characteristics? Is it a necessary requirement, or?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know. I mean, I think all of the examples that we know of intelligence, which are all natural intelligence, do also have all of those properties, right? The intelligence that we know about is an agential type of intelligence. As I said, that's what it's about. That's what it's for. That's how it's cashed out, right? Could there be a different type of intelligence that's not so sort of vested in agency? Probably. I mean, it's really hard to know. I think it would be quite a different type of intelligence. And again, it depends on, you know, there you're just running into the sort of semantics of the word intelligence, right? And, you know, if our understanding of that word right now is so situated with respect to things that agents do, then you might have to come up with a different word, for whatever it is, an alien kind of intellect that can do different types of things, or can do the same things in a different way. I think that's you're getting into sort of definitional semantics, our understanding of what the word means. We're right now, like I said, all the examples have these properties. So I think that's the way that we naturally think about what that word means.
Right. But it's conceivable that you can have something that is useful, i.e. like a computer, right, that does not have any agency, right? So it has, just like GPT-4 today, right, would be quite useful, right? But clearly it has no agency.
Absolutely. And I mean, these things are designed for, specific tasks. I mean, one of the remarkable things about GPT-4 is that it's designed for certain tasks on certain kinds of data, but it ends up being able to do other types of things pretty well as well, surprising kind of emergent properties where we don't understand where they're coming from. So, I don't want to downplay the abilities of those models, because I think it's only been out 6 months even, and it's, on a daily basis we're learning new things about it. So, it really has remarkable capabilities. However, none of those capabilities look like agency to me, but they're very impressive.